Hey guys, and welcome to this new lecture about Java Servlets and JSP. This is your notes and I'll be your voice for today. So let's dive right in. So basically, servlets and JSP is just another way of writing the backend side of a web application in Java this time. So it's a server-side Java for a web application. A server is nothing less than just another Java program which outputs an HTML page. And of course, it is a server-side technology. Now, you should be familiar with this picture over here from the PHP tutorial, where you had Apache server on the right side over here uh, that was able to execute the PHP code. The problem with just the Apache server there, when we're talking about Java, is the fact that it doesn't know how to run Java programs. And that's why for running Java programs, we will need here the servlet container named Tomcat. Tomcat is basically the most popular web container there is for Java. So let's take a little bit a step back and take a look at this diagram over here. So up until now, I want to do a little recap also. So you see here the browser. So this is where all the JavaScript, gets executed, all the HTML and also CSS code gets interpreted and displayed here on the browser. So all these three technologies, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, are basically executed on the browser. That's why up until we talked about PHP, we didn't need a web server in order to do our examples, right? So how does this work right here? So the browser creates an HTTP request to a web server. In our case, Tomcat plays the role of a web server as well. And then we do a server-side request to the Tomcat server where we have Java Servlets, Java Server pages. The execution of these pages will be then returned as a result to the browser here. So the browser can do whatever it likes with those responses. The response could also be a JSON response, which we can interpret in JavaScript and try to generate our dynamic web page. Here's the first Java Servlet example. You should be noticing these two imports here, which are coming from JavaX Servlet package from Java. The servlet class that you want to create in Java, it really needs to extend the HTTP servlet class. This is just another class that has a bunch of methods for each type of method that you want to make the request through. So for instance, if you want to do a GET request to the server, to this servlet basically, you will have to override the doGet method from the HTTP servlet class, right? If we were to do a post request, a post HTTP request, then we had to override the doPost method from the HTTP servlet class. We're gonna take a deeper look into this class later when we will be discussing about the examples. So what this will do, we'll see more about this in our examples, but this right here, what it does is it just outputs the first servlet message as a document, an HTML document. So what we're doing here, we're just printing at the standard output of this, we're just printing some HTML code. So what is actually a servlet? As I mentioned before, a servlet is a Java class which needs to extend the HTTP servlet class. And also it needs to override the do post, do get, or whatever other HTTP method that we want to create. And also we should know that this servlet will print to the standard output an HTML file, as we previously saw. Also, of course, a Java Servlet class can contain any kind of Java code that the JDK can compile. Of course, a Java Servlet needs to be compiled prior to using it as any other Java class that you want to create. It's no different than that. And of course, it needs to use the servlet-api.jar. This is a package which contains all the HTTP servlet classes and everything else that is necessary for you to create a Java servlet. Let's talk a little bit Apache Tomcat. As I mentioned before, the Apache Tomcat is the most well-known servlet JSP container. It is a web server and also knows how to run Java servlets and JSP. What else? It is developed by Apache Software Foundation, of course. It's free. The license is free. It's under the Apache Software license. And you can download it from this link right here. So you can either download the Tomcat 10. The problem with this is just the alpha version, so I recommend you to download the latest version, which is Tomcat 9 over here. And from here you can see that you have multiple versions here, so depending on your operating system, you can download like the 32-bit Windows zip, 64-bit Windows zip, or you can of course just download the zip file. I've downloaded this one just because I'm able to put it whatever I want to easier. So let's get back to this. So installing Tomcat, right? So as I said, you can download the zip distribution from that page, which is this one right here, right? You can just click download and it downloads. All right, you can go and unzip it, whatever you like. For example, in ctemp, you really need to set these two environment variables first prior to using this. So the Java home needs to point to whatever your JDK was installed, like program files, Java, JDK 1.9, 1.8, 1.10, whatever, which version of Java you're using. And also, you need to set the Catalina home path. This is basically the path to the Tomcat installation folder. Whatever you unzipped the Tomcat zip file, you will need to set that path as Catalina home. This can basically, this need to be done just for convenience so that you can run Tomcat start, Catalina start, and Catalina stop from whatever you want in the terminal. So let's see how we can start and stop Tomcat. All right, so you can see here some examples of how you can use the startup bat and shutdown bat files from Windows. You can see that these are some bat files. I'm going to show you how to do this in under Unix, because I'm having an OS X here, which is using Unix as its base. So let me open a terminal real quick. All right, so I hope you can see this. I will try to make the font bigger. All right, so here's what I've downloaded and unarchived my Tomcat, right? And let's do an ls here. You can see all the files that these have. So we need to go in bin folder. Let's do an ls here as well. So we're interested here in, as we've seen in shutdown, we're going to use the shell part or startup, or what you could also do, you could just use the Catalina starter, and I can just execute Catalina sh start. Alright, so you can see here that I've already have all these environment variables already set up on my machine, and it says that Tomcat started. Now let's see, what does this mean? How can we test whether if it started successfully or not? We're just gonna go on localhost on port 8080. Port 8080 is the default port that Tomcat uses. I didn't change this, so this is by default. So I'm just gonna go on this page, and I'm supposed to see this dashboard page that comes along with Tomcat installation, right? So it says that I'm using Apache Tomcat 9.9034, which is the exact version that I've downloaded from here, 9.034. And what I can also see here, which is pretty interesting, and I suggest you to go over as well, is these examples that you can see here, where you can find like servlets examples, JSP examples, WebSocket examples, right? So let's, for instance, go through this example. We can have this hello world example where we can just execute it. This is a hello servlet. It has this URL, and also we can take a look at the source for that, right? And it's exactly the same as the example that I've showed you before in the slides, right? All right, so let's go back. You can see here other examples. You can browse through this, look at the source code. Another thing is, let me show you where you can actually find all these examples. So here's the Apache Tomcat folder. If I go to web apps, we're gonna see in a sec what all these folders contain. If we go to web apps and we go to examples right here, we have here JSP examples, servlets, and of course WebSocket. So the JSP, we have here several JSP examples. Right here we just saw the servlets. We can also take a look at the JSP's ones, right? Whatever they do, like source, take a look at the source code, right? Like this. All right, now let me get back here. So here you can find all the JSP codes, like whatever the HTML, the JSP file. Of course, the JSP file needs to have the JSP.jsp extension. You can also browse through the servlets examples right here. We have cookies, we have hello world HTML, images, non-blocking, and so on and so forth, which I suggest you can take a look over these standard examples that Tomcat has included in its sources by default. Alright, let's get back a little bit to the presentation right here. Okay, so Tomcat standard folders. So it contains the bin folder, which actually contains the executables files for controlling the server, as we've previously saw. Right? Let me drag this back in. So here we have all the executables that we can use for this. Then we have the conf folder, conf folder, which contains all the configurations files that we need to do to our Tomcat. The most important is the server XML. Let's take a little look. The server XML, how does it look like? So here's how it looks like. Global naming resources, like this is the resource, the user database resource. So for instance, let's say that if you need to deploy your application into a Tomcat server, you will need to come here and create global resources for your, let's say, for example, for the database connection. You will need to define the username, the password, where the server is, and so on. So you can declare resources for each and every configuration like that, so that you don't have it hard-coded in your application. You just have it here in the server XML file. All right, and you can see that you can do more things in here. I'm not gonna go into details about this. If you want to, you can go ahead and take a deeper look into it. And also another important file from here is the web.xml file, which actually can contain the servlets that are deployed in the Tomcat server. This web.xml file this is the general one, but your application can have a different web.xml file. We'll see in a minute some examples and how that will look like. All right, the next folder is the lib folder, which is basically a folder that contains all the libraries or the jar files used by Tomcat and the deployed application. Here they are, real quick. All right, so these are used by Tomcat, and for instance, the connector, MySQL connector J, which I've added before, just so we can connect from our servlet to MySQL database. Then we have the logs folder. The logs folder, what do you think it contains? It contains the log files, right? I will not go into details about this because they are pretty straightforward. Then we have the temp folder, which stores the temporary files. And then we have the web apps folder. This is an important folder because this folder contains the web application that is being deployed, right? And also we have the work folder. Let me show you. I've already showed you the web apps application. I'm gonna go over it again real quick. So here's what we have the examples. Here's actually all the sources behind this page, right? This dashboard page. So all the sources for this page, you will find them in this web apps folder. All right. And then we have the work folder, which contains files created by Tomcat during running. For instance, all the JSP files are being converted to actually servlets, right? So those servlets will be kept in here. Now let's talk a little bit about the format of a web application. So web applications are stored, as I mentioned before, in the web apps folder, either as a folder or as a .var file. This is just an archive basically that contains all the Java classes, all the JSP files or the libraries that are necessary for our application to run successfully. A web application, it's either a folder or a var file, must contain the following. So it must contain the webinf folder, and in the webinf folder we also have to have our custom web.xml file, which contains the configuration file for our servlets. We'll see in a second how that looks like. Optionally, the web folder can contain the following subfolders, which are classes and libs. Classes contains the actual servlets of our application, and the lib folder contains the additional jars that are necessary for our application to run successfully. All the other HTML, JSP, and all the other resources files like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, those files can be placed anywhere in the web application home folder, right? So whatever you put them, it's fine. Also, servlets must be placed in the folder or subfolders of web-inf/classes. So this is a very simple version of a web.xml file. So here we're just stating all the XML version, of course, the encoding, the web app, and here we're defining our web app. And how does this, here, this is just an empty web XML file. And in that web XML file, we add the configuration for our servlets. This is how the configuration for a servlet looks like. We have the servlet tag. Within the servlet tag, we defined a servlet name for our servlet. We map this servlet name to a particular class that contains the code of our servlet. And after doing so, we use this servlet name and map it to a particular URL because we need to expose our servlets through a URL because the client needs to have a URL in order to make an HTTP request, of course, right? So we're defining this using the servlet mapping tag where we use the previously defined servlet name and map it to a particular URL pattern, right? It is a pattern. We could have here wildcards as well, right? So we could have here /star or /URL of the star, and whatever our URL looks like, if it starts with URL of the followed by whatever, that will map to our servlet name, which ends up translated, and the class that and the class that's behind the servlet name will be executed. Now let's talk a little bit about JSP. As I said before, if you want to have a JSP file, you need to add the .jsp extension to that file, and that file is pretty similar with what you've seen at the in a .php file, where you can, in this particular case, you will be able to mix your Java code with the HTML code, and of course the JavaScript code, CSS code, and so on and so forth. I recommend you add those the JavaScript code and also the CSS code in separate file and try not to mix them in the same HTML file that contains JSP code like Java code and actual HTML code. The Java code needs to go within these tags. So pretty similar with what we had at PHP, right? There we had the PHP tags. Here, these are the tags specifically for JSP. And you should know that Tomcat will create a servlet from the JSP file, which will be saved in the work folder. And when the JSP is requested, the servlet is executed, and of course the output of that execution will be sent back to the client. So what this means is that on the server side, all the code that goes within these tags will be executed, and only the result of that execution will be returned to the client. Basically, it will replace these tags with the execution of the code that contains these tags. Here's a pretty simple JSP file where we're just using the out object to print line the first that string there, first JSP it works, and the break line. All right, and of course the proper HTML tags that you can see here. So basically in this particular scenario, Tomcat will run this line. This is Java code, right? And will replace these tags with the execution result of this code over here. And that will be returned back to the client as an HTML document. Any additional documentation you will be able to find here on Forest's page, where we also have the examples, which we're gonna go into details next. Okay, so let's start with the first example, which is the first example from this list over here. MVC example, IntelliJ IDEA 13.1.13 zip file. Go ahead, download it, unzip it, put it into your workspace folder, and let's use IntelliJ to open it. So here I have IntelliJ opened. Here's what the example that we've just downloaded. I unzipped it. You can just go into open and go to your workspace folder and just try to open this this project in IntelliJ. Alright, so there are several things that you need to do in order to have this up and running on your local IntelliJ. First of all, you need to go to the file project structure, to the project right here, and try to select the proper SDK that you want to run this project with. For instance, I do have Java 11 installed on my machine, so I'm gonna go and use that one. I will hit apply and OK. Right now I can see that so here's the structure of this project. Under source we have these three classes. Now we can see that everything compiles successfully here, right? We don't have any red errors, let's call them like that. All right, here's so as we've seen before in the presentation, we need to have our project, our servlet project needs to have a webin folder, and within this webin folder we need to have a web.xml file, right, where we have everything defined. Wait, before going into details about the code, let's fix another problem that we have over here in order to be able to run it on our local laptops. We need to fix this Tomcat issue over here. We're going to use Tomcat, as mentioned before, as a servlet container, so we need to configure that as well over here. So under here you just hit edit configurations. So you can see it tries to use Tomcat 7 whatever. I do have Tomcat 9 already configured, already downloaded and unzipped. What you need to do here, you can go even deeper into configure right here and choose a name for your Tomcat instance, and just select the Apache Tomcat path where you unzipped the folder, right? Just select this and you'll be good to go. I don't want to launch anything. All right. Let's check the deployment. This looks good. All right, hit apply and OK. So now we'll be able to run it successfully. But before we run it, let's take a little look here at the web.xml file. Let's see what we have here, right? Because we don't know what we have until we take a look at this file. So here we have all the servlets defined. We have this servlet login controller that is mapped over this servlet class. And this servlet controller is used here in the servlet mapping section to map it to the login controller, right? This means that from somewhere from our application, we need to have a way to call this login controller. Now let's see, where is that? We have here the login HTML file. This is just an HTML file containing a form. This form over here, which has as action the login controller. So when we submit this form, the login controller will be hit using the post method, right? This is how we define to a form the method that we want to use for the HTTP request to this action, which in our case is the login controller. And what we're passing here to this login controller, we're passing the username and a password. We have two input fields there, and an input that is type submit, which will actually submit the form that we are seeing here. All right, let's get back to the web.xml file. So from here, we can navigate through the class that is mapped to the login controller. All right, just like that. And we can see here all the imports, of course, the important ones about servlets, all right? All of these. And you can see that it extends the HTTP servlet class. Let's take a little look at this class. This is just the decompiled sources of the HTTP servlet class, but we can also browse it using just the decompiled class. We can see here this extends a generic servlet. We don't need to go into details about that. You just need to know that you need to override the do-get method if you want to create, if you want to call your servlet through the get HTTP method. If you want to do to make a post request, then you have to override the post method. If you want to do a put, if you want to make a put request, you have to override the do put method, and so on, so forth. Do delete, and so on, so forth. All right. Okay. In our case here, we're overriding the do post method because we've seen here in the login HTML file that we're using the post method, right? Okay, so what we'll be doing here is we're gonna access the username and password from the request object. You can see that this doPost method has two variables, two objects passed to it. One of them is the HTTP servlet request, where we have access to all the properties from the request, right, including the headers and everything else, the list of cookies and so on. And in the HTTP servlet response, we're gonna actually write the response of our servlet. All right, so here you can see sender, send status, set, get headers, and so on. So let's continue. We put the username in a variable, then we put the password in another variable over here. We're using this authenticator object. Let's take a look at this authenticator object. This is basically where we connect to our database, which is a MySQL database. And this is how you need to connect to a MySQL database from Java. Probably you already know this, but let's go over it again right here. We need to set the class for name. This will be the driver that's being used for connecting to the MySQL server from Java. Then we need to create a connection object using the driver manager dot get connection, and here we're supposed to specify the URL to our database, username, and of course a password. And then we create our statement using this connection by calling the create statement method of the connection object. All right, and then we have another method here, authenticate, which gets as input two objects, one of two strings, the username and the password. And what it does is it executes a query where we do select all from users, where user equals username and password equals password. And if this statement returns something, then it means that the authentication was successfully made. Otherwise, we're just returning an error, right? So this result here is returned as a response for this authenticate method, representing whether the user was successfully found in the database or not. Back to our example here. Into our login controller, after creating the authenticator object, we use this to authenticate the user and the password that we just received as request parameters. And if the result for this equals success, then using the request dispatcher over here, we're telling this servlet where to go next. In our case here, we're redirecting to the success JSP. We also create a user object which contains just a username and a password. What we're doing with the user object, we're setting it as attribute on the request object over here. This attribute, consider the attributes, think of them as a map where you have a key and a value. Here we're setting the attribute user with the value user. Otherwise, if the authentication didn't go successfully, we just say that this dispatcher will redirect to error JSP. And here we're just calling from the request dispatcher object, we're just calling forward with the request object and the response object that we just processed. All right, this means that our application can go two ways, to the error page or the success page JSP. Let's take a look a little bit at the error JSP page. So this is just an HTML page that contains the login failed message. And the success JSP page, what it does is it uses these tags for JSP, and it tries to get the attribute, the user attribute, from the request objects. It casts it to the user object, and using the out object that we have available here, we're just printing the message welcome get username. All right, so pretty straightforward, right? Let's see it in action now. I will just try to debug this through. So now it is building, and it is still building. All right. So what does it say here? Protocol handled failed. Connection port. Oh, all right. I think I still have from before. I didn't close. Let's test this. Not there, but here. This is still all right. Yeah. So I need to close this first. Remember, I've started Tomcat on my local machine, but I forgot to turn it off. Now let's go and turn it off. It was into Documents, Tomcat, Apache Tomcat under bin folder. I will call Carolina stop command. Alright, now this should not work anymore. Okay, great. Now I can start my Tomcat from here because we've configured right here to use the same Tomcat that I've just stopped. Alright, now let's see if this time works. Alright, no errors this time. Connected to the server. Now let me go here. So what I need to do from here, I need to actually access the login HTML. Let's try to do that. So I'm gonna type here /login.html. All right, I can see that form, right? So let's get back a little bit right here. So here, as a not here, but here. So what you will need to do over here in order to make this example work, you will have to also create a table in your database. Let's talk a little bit more about that. This will not work right now. Whatever, we'll just type whatever kind of password here because this will fail anyways because I didn't configure anything related to the database connection string. So let's try to see what error was I getting here. Like you can see the trace log for this exception. So first it failed in login controller, then in authenticator, Java line 18, right? So right where I'm trying to connect to the database. And that's because I don't have, first of all, I don't have a database called Forest. I have WP. And you can see here that it says access denied for the user root at localhost, which means I do have a password here, which I need to set. So this is my very secret password. All right, so as I mentioned before, in order for you guys to run this example, you will need to create a users table. So I do have MySQL installed here on my local laptop. If you do not have MySQL installed, you can either use the MySQL server that you automatically installed when you installed XAMPP for the PHP lab, or you can of course use your local MySQL that you already had installed. So I don't have XAMPP here. I have installed the MySQL server separately, and I'm using this MySQL Workbench. So here I'm just gonna connect to the WP database. Let's browse here. So I do have already a table users that's been created. Let's try to see what does it contain. So it contains here 2 rows, a username, Ionut and Forest, and password here. So I'm gonna use this table and this particular user to connect to my app right here. So I did change the database and I also updated the password. And I have to restart the Tomcat server. Remember, whatever change you want to do here in the Java code or the JSP code, you need to restart the server. Otherwise, your changes will not be taken into consideration by Tomcat. So you need to compile the classes again, right? Compile them again and do the deploy again. All right, now let's see if it works now. So username Ionut, password, whatever password. Let's see, still getting a 500 internal server error. Let's see why this time. So okay, so the server time zone value EST is unrecognized. This is another thing that you need to do if you're using the latest version of MySQL. So what I'm gonna do is I will set another property here in the connection string for the database, another property which defines the server time zone. So I will just say server time zone equals UTC. All right, now let's see if this will work. I'll stop my server and I will restart it again. Okay. All right, there we go. Let's see if it continues to fail or not. All right, this time it said it failed, but we also got an exception here saying that unknown column user. All right, and that's because when I created my users table, I've renamed the user column to username. I will have to do this change too. All right, restart the server. All right, so I will just type here password, and this time works successfully. All right, so this is the first example. Oh, wait, another important thing that you need to know about how to connect to the database, like about the database connection, you will have to go and download the MySQL connector J. So that's a jar file. Let's go and Google for that. Connector Java, and it's supposed to be provided by MySQL. All right, so the latest version is the connector J 8.0.20. You just here choose the operating system that you want to download it from. You can use like platform independent. This means it will download the jar file in zipped right here. You can download this one. Then you can unzip it, and let me show you real quick how it looks like. So you will have to take that that MySQL connector jar file and place it into your lib folder within the Apache Tomcat folder, right over here. It's lib. So here you can see previously I've been using an older version of MySQL, and that's why I have this MySQL connector Java 5.1. But with the latest version, that's not working anymore. So you will need to use the latest one, which is the 8.0.20 jar. All right. So you will have to have that in your lib folder in your Tomcat installation. All right. Now let's go to the next example. The next example, which we can of course download from Forest's page, and which is this MVC example with Ajax JSON this time, and try to see how we can also include Ajax, and how we can make Ajax requests to our servlets. I've already downloaded this. You can see right here, and unzipped it and placed it into my workspace folder. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead in my IntelliJ and open that project as well. Just the same as I opened the previous one. So probably here we'll need to do the same configuration, because you can see that the SDK is not defined. So I'm going to go to the project structure over here to the project, and I'm going to select Java 11. I'm going to hit apply, and of course I will also have to edit the Tomcat configuration here and set the Tomcat. Remember, as we did before, you just have to have another configuration over here for your that points to where you've unzipped the Tomcat server. All right, I don't need these. Hit apply. All right, so let's take a second to browse a little bit this project. So it contains, of course, the source folder, the web folder. The source folder contains several classes over here. Then the web folder contains several JSP files. We also have here another folder where we placed all our JavaScript code. And of course we have the web.in folder. Let's take a look at the servlets that we've defined here. So we have the login controller, as we did before. This is mapped to the login controller class. So this is the exact login control that we had before. And we also have here the assets controller, which is mapped to the assets controller class. We're gonna see in a minute what all this does. First, let's try to see it in action. Let's see if it works. One more thing, of course, I forgot to configure my database connection. So this points to the WP root password VP root. All right. I also have to set the time zone property right here. I will just copy it from here and paste it over here. And of course, since I renamed the column differently here, I'll have to rename it in here as well. All right, now let's see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll just have to see why it doesn't, right? All right, so this time we have an index HTML, where, as before, I have my username, my password. I will hit here password, hit enter, login failed, let's see why. services running local. So let's see what happened. So column user not found, of course. Column user not found. There you are. Username. All right. Okay, seems like everything's alright now. Try again. Alright, so what I have here is I can see some assets for my username over here. I have previously entered some assets in the database. These are the assets that I've added. I can also update an asset by just typing its ID. Here's the ID of the assets. Let's say the third asset. I will try to say assign it to myself, and the asset description, new third description, value 3000. Update asset, get assets again. Seems like it didn't work. Alright, let's try to see what's going on in here. I'm glad that this didn't work because we can also debug together this. So let's see what's going on. If I'm doing this, request is made, and seems that it is not. Doesn't return the updated value. Let's try to update this. Alright, so this is failing. This is returning me 500 there. Okay, so this is what I was getting. It says for input string Ionuts, number format exception. Of course, because here I'm supposed to enter the user ID for my user, which is 1. Then I will hit update. It says update asset successfully. Then when I get the assets, I get the new updated value for the third asset, right? Okay. So now you've seen what this example does. Now let's try to see it in action. So first we started with index.html, right? From the index.html we made a request, a post request to the login controller. So the login controller, what it does is it just authenticates my user, the same as it did before. Won't go into details here. And then I was getting the success JSP page, right? So this is the success JSP page. So let's see what do we have here. So here we have the user, then we're getting, we define the user here, a variable the user, then we're getting the user from the session attribute, because in the login controller here you can see that we're creating, we're getting the session here, and we're setting the session attribute over here. So this allows us to do this, to get the user from the session. If the user is null, that will just print welcome, is different than null, we will be printing welcome username. Then we have a little bit of HTML here which defines the update assets here. This is the get assets, where we also have a button for get assets. So this is the button that we have over here. And then we have the update assets, and then we have this section over here, which is a table. And what else? Here we have the script defined, the JavaScript defined. All right, so what we do here, we're using jQuery in order to do the to easily do the JavaScript DOM manipulation, and also, of course, the AJAX requests. So what we're defining here, we're selecting the button, the get assets button. We're selecting the by ID. We're doing jQuery of get assets button ID, and we define what should happen on click. And what should happen on click is it will try to get user assets for the user ID that I'm logged in with. See how we see what we did here? We kind of we passed Java variable, I mean the execution of the Java variable as an input to the JavaScript function. So the problem with this is this will not end up like this on the client side, right? If we're looking, for instance, here, let's go back and open the sources a little quick. In here, and if we're looking at this page, okay, we just have to look at the sources because it's in the same success JSP. Okay, so we're gonna look here. Here is the script, right? And here is the get user assets function we were talking before. So see how this code right here, so this code was first executed on the server side, right? It's a JSP, and what we said is that all the JSP tags will be replaced by the execution of the code within the JSP tags, right? So here we have user.getUserID, which means this will return a number representing the ID of the user that I'm logged in with. And here on the client side, this is the code that ended up on the client side, right? The same JavaScript code, but this time I don't have the JSP thing over here, I just have the result of it, right? Cool. And I'm also passing here another function, so get user assets by user, and this function. In the function I log here some the assets that I am trying to render. Then I'm trying to access the I'm just emptying up the assets table. The assets table is the ID of the what is that? Here it is, the ID of the table where I will try to add the assets that I will receive from the AJAX request that I'll do. I'm appending a table row containing the table header to this table, and for each and every asset over here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to append to my table a new row, and each asset contains an ID, a user ID description, and a value. All right. Let's take a look at what the get user assets does now, right? Because we didn't look at that. So that's defined in the Ajax utils.js file, And what it does is, we can see here that it receives as an argument the user ID and the callback function. The user ID will be used in the Ajax request. Here we're performing a get JSON request to the assets controller with the action get all for this user ID. And after this gets executed, this callback function gets executed, which is basically the function that we just went through over here, this function over here, right? So that's the callback function to get user assets. All right, now let's see what happens when I click the update button. Here's where we define what should happen when we click the update button, update asset button, which is this button. So this is calling this particular function, update asset, which is also defined in the Ajax utils.js file. And we can see that it gets as input an ID, a user ID, the ID of the asset, the user ID that will be set to the asset with ID defined here, the new description, the new value, and of course a callback function. And what this function does is it makes a GET request to the assets controller with the action update for these 4 values. And the callback function, what that does is, it's this function which basically sets the response that you can see here, update assets successfully, into, it just says jQuery, selects by ID the update results section, which is this section over here, and sets the HTML for that section with the response that I got from the server for the Ajax request response. All right, now this is the JavaScript. Now let's take a deeper look into what things how are things happening on the backend side. So first, we said we're doing the get assets request, right? Let's also try to debug this assets controller. I will just add the breakpoint here. I will hit get assets. That hit the breakpoint. So this is the assets controller. This is the doGet method. And let's see what's going on. So we're getting the action from the request. The action is passed as an argument, as a parameter to the request, to this get request. Let's go next. Okay, it doesn't equal the action. It's not update. It says get all. All right, so it will enter this part over here, and here what we're doing, we're getting the user ID. Remember we passed, so here we passed the user ID when we did this, right? All right, so here we're taking that user ID from the request object, and what we are going to do with that, we're gonna use the DB manager object to basically get the user assets for that particular user ID. Let's see what this does. So what this does is it executes select all from assets where the user ID equals user ID, and returns back a assets array list containing all the assets for that particular user ID. All right, let's go back. And then we're using this JSON array object, which will basically contain all the assets formatted as JSON. And here's where we're looping through the assets for the logged in user. And we're going to create like a new JSON object for each asset. And for each JSON object, we're going to say put ID the ID of the asset, user ID, the user ID of the asset, and so on and so forth. And I will add that the JSON object to the JSON assets array. All right, and then we're using the print writer from the response output stream. So this is the response that we're returning back to the client, and we are writing to that out variable, to that print writer. We're just writing the JSON assets dot to JSON string. So we're converting the JSON object to a string, and of course we call flash so that it goes through. All right, so that's with the first part. The second part, with the update part, let's just leave the breakpoint. I got this response, so let's try to also take a look at here. So here we can also try to inspect what request we did. So we did a request to assets controller. We did a get request, and we passed as query string parameters the action, which is get all, and the user ID, which is the ID of the user that I'm logged in with. And as a response to this, let's hit preview. So here's the response. Here's the raw string that I have outputted here, right? I said to JSON string, but here I can see it in a more tree structure type of way. So here is the array, and here are all the assets in the JSON format, right? Which I'm processing here in JavaScript, right? Get assets, the assets, and for each asset, I'm creating a new table row in this table. All right, now let's see the next one. The next request, which is update. Let's see, I will just type some more numbers here. This, and see which way we're gonna go now in the assets controller. So this time we have the action, which is update, right? So it will hit this part of the if statement. And what I'm doing here, I'm creating an asset from the request parameters. Let's take a little look here. So we don't have a response here, right? Because the code, the server side didn't finish. But we can see the request that we did over here. We did the assets controller request with action update. Let's take a look at the query string parameters here because it's prettier. It's update. The ID is 3, ID of the asset, user ID, the new description, and the new value. And from those parameters, we're going to create here a new asset. We're going to use the database, the DB manager, to update the asset. So let's see the update asset. Here we're just performing an update statement for that particular asset. After that's done, we're preparing our writer again, in which we will be typing either update as asset successfully or if there was an error or not. This time it will be successfully update, flash, and that's it. And now if we take a look at the preview for this, did it fail? Oh, I still have another breakpoint. I'm sorry. So we can we can see here that update asset successfully the message that we outputted from the servlet. All right. So there you go. There's another example with servlets and JSP and JavaScript, and how we can create AJAX requests to a servlet. Next, I want to show you how you can do a manual deployment to Tomcat. So up until now, all the examples that we did, we started the Tomcat from IntelliJ, right? We configured the Tomcat here as a Tomcat server. We had to set the path to the Tomcat that we've installed on our local machines. But this is a typical development environment that we have here. A normal application that gets deployed to a particular server, there you don't start your IntelliJ, right, and leave it open forever. You just need to do different things. So what we're gonna do here, we're gonna try to do a deployment manually. So let's do this. Let me stop this server first, right? Let me see, all right? It is not working anymore, which is what we intended. So in order for us to do a manual deployment, so here we have the sources. In order to do a manual deployment, we will have to create that, remember that var file that we were talking at the beginning? And that var file needs to contain the compiled classes, not the Java sources, right? By the way, the var file comes from web archive. That's where the var, W-A-R, comes from, web archive. All right, so that web archive needs to contain the compiled code for our application. You can see here in IntelliJ, the compiled code goes into the out artifacts, of course, the name of the project, JS, webinf, classes, web UBB. So these are the classes, the compiled classes that we were talking before, right? So what we need to do, we need to create a var file out of all these files. JSPs are still JSPs because they only get converted into servlets by Tomcat when they are being called. All right, so these are still here. HTML is still HTML that's not compiled, right? JavaScript is still JavaScript that still doesn't compile to anything, so it's still plain JavaScript. So let's try to do this. Let's try to create a var file out of this and try to copy it to the Tomcat folder and try to deploy it there. All right, so in order to create the var file, what we're gonna do is we're gonna open up a terminal. All right, and what we're gonna do is, let me make the font a little bit bigger. I hope it's enough. I will go into Documents, Workspace, Java examples, MVC, this one. I'm gonna go here, I'm gonna do an ls, then I'm gonna go into the out folder. In the out folder we have artifacts. In the artifacts we have this folder over here. So these are our compiled sources. So what we want to do now is, let me see what happened, because I don't see, oh no, it's there. There it is. All right. So I'm still in the here in the out folder, in the artifacts where my project is compiled. And what we're gonna do here, we're gonna just call the jar command with C argument, which is used for create file. Then we'll also use the V to generate verbose output, and we're gonna use the F function to specify the archive file name, which in our case will be, let's say, how should we call our file? Let's say example3.var file, and by star we will be saying that all the files within the current folder will get archived. All the files and folders recursively will be archived into the example3 var file. All right, let's see. Here's our example3 var file, and what I'm going to do with that, I will copy it to the Tomcat folder, right? Into where? Into the web apps folder, right? And then I'm gonna go into the Tomcat folder, cd web apps, where is it? Okay, so my CP didn't work. All right, let me go back here. What just happened? Come on. CD documents workspace artifacts. All right, CP example3 in documents Tomcat web apps. Hope that worked. All right, cd documents Tomcat web apps. All right, there it is, example3 var file. All right, now let's go. So we placed the var file into the web apps folder. Let's go up a little bit. Let's go into the bin folder and let's say Catalina start. All right, let's go back to the web apps folder, see what happened. cd web apps. All right, so we can see that before we just had the var file, and that's it. Now we also have a another folder, which is basically the var file exploded. All right, now let's get into the browser, and from here let's see if Tomcat is running. Yes, it is up. In order for us to be able to access our example here, we will have to say example3/example3. Now we got our login screen. I'm gonna log in with this, get assets, and everything's working. This time I did a manual deploy. All right. Next, I want to show you how to create a project like this in IntelliJ from scratch, because I've been getting this question from a lot of students in the past years. Like they don't know exactly what kind of project they need to create in IntelliJ so that they can configure it with Tomcat and everything else that I've shown you today. So let's try to do that. It's pretty simple. All you need to do is go into under the file, new project, select Java here, then click on Java web application, then hit next. Let's give it a name like my test app. Hit finish, create the folder because it doesn't exist, of course. And here we can see that the folder structure was automatically configured, was automatically generated. All we have to do now is go to project structure. Let's see if the JDK was successfully set it. It was. Now, the next step would be to start writing code in the source, creating JSP files. I'm not going to do that again. I will just try to copy something from a previous example that we did today, the first example. I will just copy that package. I will paste that package in here. Then I will copy the contents of the web folder as well. Here you can see that a web.xml file was created, an empty web.xml file was created. So I'm going to replace everything in here with what I've copied from the other project. All right, I want to override for all. All right. We can see here that the HTTP servlet class is missing. This means that we need to add it to our dependencies. So how we can do that, we just let IntelliJ suggest us what to do, and we can just add Java E6 jars to module dependencies. We can select to download those. They were downloaded, and add it to the lib folder over here, right? The servlets jars. Okay, the next step would be to configure the running configuration over here. From where I will hit the plus button, I will select Tomcat server, local Tomcat server. Let's give it a name, my local Tomcat. And here you need to configure the path to your local Tomcat server. Also, what we're gonna do is, you can see here we have another warning saying that no artifacts marked for deployment. Let's try to fix that as well. We need to go under the deployment tab over here, select the plus button over here and add artifact. All right. We also want to get rid of this. If you want to have multiple artifacts deployed to your server, you can give them a name. We will only have just one, so I will remove this. I will just let slash there. All right, I'm gonna hit apply. Then under the server, let's check again. All right, great. Now let's start this. Either debug mode or just run it. Alright, connected to server. Alright, let's hit refresh over here. What was this example with? Alright, with the login HTML page, right? Login.html. So it works. And that's how you create a new project from scratch in IntelliJ, if you want to know. Alright, I think it was enough for this lecture. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and stay home.